Hello, and welcome to the Take a Breather podcast with Stacy Every and myself, Eric Almeida. Remember to like, subscribe, give us 5-star reviews on Apple and all that fun stuff if you like this podcast. That helps us out a great deal. Today, it's just Stacy and myself, and today we're actually going to be talking about the topic of death. This is going to sound kind of hilarious, but Stacy and I are actually quite excited to talk about death. This is one of the episodes we've been wanting to record for a while, as weird as that might sound. But we do want to preface that we are going to have an incredibly in-depth and serious and silly and ridiculous conversation about death, how death affects us all, how death has been affecting us as individuals, and all of that fun jazz. So if for whatever reason the topic of death is triggering for you, or someone you know has recently died or is about or is dying, and you're not comfortable listening to this right now, that's fine. Don't listen to this at another time, or don't listen to this episode at all. So we are going to just kind of take it from there. And essentially, the way Stacey and I were talking right before we started was just about starting with the fact that no one talks about this. No one talks about death in any kind of like in-depth manner for a multitude of reasons that I don't know. Like, is it because it's impolite? Is it because it's an awkward conversation? Is it because no one wants to think about the fact that, we will all die? It is unavoidable. Like, or is it all the above? I don't know.
Well, it's the fear piece. In fact, one reason we started the conversation started with the two, I guess, three things that have been catalysts for this conversation was that you've lost quite a few people yourself in your extended family last year,
Hmm.
and I lost my father in December. And then you were reading that book that specifically talks about the seven major fears around that people have around death,
So,
which
so just to clarify, I am reading a book. It's called A Denial of Death by Ernest Becker from back in the 70s, which is talking about the psychological component of death. But the seven fears around death, I took from a YouTuber who is also a mortician, Caitlin
oh
Dowdy. Just
right.
to clarify that, in
Oh,
case some of the
I
listeners know who
over
Caitlin Dowdy is. Yeah.
I overlapped
Oh, no
your
worries. It's a
information.
lot of death.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
But no, yeah,
Yes,
no, you're
yeah.
right.
So
Go ahead.
we had just been talking about the fact that well, I guess I'll preface by saying my own experience and how I've had my father was ill for quite a long time and with a neurological condition, and so he was simply having less and less mobility, and he was starting to get forgetful, and he insisted on living alone, and uh, tried several times to have the conversation less about him dying and more about, how are you going to manage, what do you want for yourself to manage your life as you become more and more infirm. And he simply refused to talk about it, and much to the anxiety of me and my sister. About He wanted to live alone, he didn't want to have a lifeline. He wanted to be independent. He wanted to live the life as best he could, even though it was becoming more and more limited. But he wanted to choose completely his own environments and who he associated with. And I respected that. And he was clearly going to need help very soon. So he had a will, and he was very clear. It was relatively simple in the case of me and my sister. It was just the two of us, and he's like, "I got a will, and well, what are your wishes for?" And he didn't want to talk to us about his wishes. He didn't want to talk about what he wanted after he died. He didn't want to talk about him dying at all. Much less, he didn't even want to talk about how he wanted to take care of himself once he needed care. So like the whole conversation around just getting old is really, I realize it goes beyond death, right? It's getting older in the first place. It's needing care in the first. It's needing to rely on family or on a system to take care of you when you're no longer able to do it yourself. And everyone's terrified of losing that independence. So, which and I think there's a lot of reasons for that, and we could go off on that topic as well, as far as why. There's a lot of things to fear on this conversation, and not a lot of people. I think people are often willing to talk about like the idea of death. Like my father used to say, well, if I ever need to go to a nursing home, just drop me off a bridge, and he was only half joking. Like, Dad, that's not an actual choice, right? Like that's okay. At least now I understand the depth of your lack of interest in going to a nursing home. That's good to know, but but actually being explicit about your own personal desires around getting sick or dying, what you want to ask, what kind of help you're willing to receive, is another point of contention for a lot of people. Being, and then there's, of course, there's practical applications too. Like if you don't have a lot of money, going to a facility that's subpar. There's a lot of people have a lot of fear about going to, ending up in facilities that are subpar, dying alone. So they assume just don't want to talk about it at all, and which I can understand. It does become scary, and also it's going to happen, and so being explicit about it. There's so many things we're often afraid of that are even more scary when we suppress them.
Yes. Well,
It becomes
going
this giant monster when we suppress it. But when you get it out in the open, there's actually are choices and there are options. But it takes this a little bit of energy to step forward into that fear and look at it head on.
absolutely. And honestly, I would assume that those of us who even think about it want the ideal version of to be full of vitality and life and mobility and then just to die peacefully in one sleep, which doesn't happen most of the time. And so think you and I are still quite young, but like imagine someone saying to us, do you want to get a lifeline to carry around your neck at all times because you are essentially on the verge of incompetent? And it's like that would be massively insulting. And so it's there is that huge component of it of like we will be for the vast majority of human beings, they will have been adults, fully capable functioning adults for so much longer than when to the point where they forget what it was like to be a little kid when they needed help. And then towards the end of their life, if they get to that point where it's the ravages of aging that takes them out, when they start to decline in their capabilities, to then revert back to that needing care like they were with as a kid, like yes, it's natural, but it's also it's cruel to kind of like for that to happen to us again. It's like we you know we gain all of this capability and responsibility and self-direction and self-control only to have to give it up later on in life.
Yes, and that's a cultural decision. That's a culture. It's a cultural belief. Not I don't know. It's there's what's natural to us in biology and what's cultural as far as our belief systems are concerned. And it's actually natural for us to go in the progression from birth to death. We in fact do come full circle back to where we do need care and midwifing into. Like I could have a whole conversation about the dying process is like being, they call them death doulas. There are people you
Yep.
can hire who are there, and doula, for those of you who don't know, is someone who's there at the birth of a child to help the mother give birth to the baby, and there's death doulas to help you transition into death. And it's such a similar process. It's startling. The When someone is dying, you're with someone who is dying, and I was with my father when he at the end, the the energy of it, the kind of things that happen to one's body is remarkably familiar as someone who's given birth. There's a weird parallel between transitioning the body so that it can die and transitioning the body so that it can give birth.
That's so interesting.
It's really fast. I noticed it with my mother-in-law, and I noticed it with my father, that it just had the way the body is inward and processing something. When you're giving birth, there's such an inwardness that happens, and like the whole focus is on making sure that the passage is open and the baby can be born in a healthy and a way that's the best possible outcome for mother and child. and the body is really doing this shifting, transitioning, opening thing. And there's this movement, downward movement, in Chinese medicine, like we were talking to Lynn last time. There's, they even you can ask acupuncturists to specifically stimulate points that help just with downward, this a movement through, right? You're moving something through. And so with death, like I felt the same thing with my father. He was moving moving the spirit through, moving through. His body had to come to a place of transition, or be a vehicle of transition of the soul, birthing the soul into the next life, whatever it is you may believe. And so I forget why I started going down this path, and coming
but
around
but
full
no,
circle.
what you're saying is really, and
The full circle thing.
yes, yeah.
Yeah, right.
But no, like what you're saying, I wish I remember what study or what article I read that said this, but there was some kind of scientific article that I read that described that in a similar way, that like when a person's body, when it comes to dying of old age, that it is this like this process where the system slowly starts to shut down, and that there are things that can be detected. I think they said up to 2 weeks ahead of time of what I
Really?
think. I don't, like I said, I don't recall what I read, so I don't want to misquote what remnants are in my head, but that there was like similar to what you described in comparison to birth as well, of like the system is slowly starting to shut down thing, this, and like it just, because the body knows that it's running out of time, and then like it just starts to start, as weird as it might sound, it starts turning itself off, because like it our cells do have a function built into them for our cells to terminate themselves when they're at the end of their individual cellular life. If that doesn't happen, it turns into cancer. Like our cells are supposed to die.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, so our cells have an internal kill switch, and when that kill switch gets messed up through cellular division and damage to the DNA and all that kind of stuff, that's what turns into cancer. That's why cancer is a ravaging thing of old age. It's because all of these systems that are designed to prevent that from happening slowly start to break down. And then you end up getting cells that just keep going. And they're just like, oh, I'm just going to keep, reproducing myself indefinitely, even though this part of this body doesn't need any more of it.
So it's like the body itself is rejecting the idea of death.
In a very bizarre way, yes. It's so I have heard it described.
Fascinating.
I have heard described that cancer in a weird way is the cells kind of playing the immortality game and being like, I'm just going to keep going, and I want there to be lots of me. And so, because if you think of like, that might sound very strange, but if you think about it,
No, it actually makes perfect. I mean, go ahead. It makes
no,
perfect
but
sense,
if you
actually.
think about it, like, we're constantly reproducing all of the cells in our body at a certain rate in order for our full body to be functional. We were playing this very interesting biological dancing game of like, your eyes regenerate at this rate, your bones regenerate at that rate, your skin regenerates at this rate, your stomach, blah, blah, blah. If any of those things start regenerating at the wrong pace, if they go too slow, it means that injuries don't heal as they should. If they go too fast, then you get tumors. Tumors are essentially whatever that cell was. Let's say it was, a skin cell. That the tumor is just that skin cell being like, hey, there's nothing telling me to stop making more. And then all of a sudden you have a giant growth that is the cancer. So there is this biological off switch, and we've had it since birth. We need our systems to stop. There's a reason why
Yes.
we don't keep growing. There's a reason why humans aren't 20 feet tall. Like, we have like these preset systems of like, we do this, we grow up, we develop to this point, and then we kind of stabilize and go from there. And then we, because of time, we slowly, our ability to reproduce degrades. Like, if you take a photocopy and then you photocopy the photocopy and then you photocopy the photocopy of the photocopy, like the quality continues to degrade. That's happening in our cells. It's the DNA slowly starts to degrade, and the systems to fix that degrade as well. And so it's a reason why cancer is becoming so predominant today, because we're living so goddamn long. We're getting rid of the easier illnesses to combat.
Well,
Back.
we talk about the mind body connection all the
Mm-hmm.
time on this. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a fundamental aspect of why I want to have this podcast is that the separation of mind and body has been this persistent Western modality for such a long time, and it's fundamentally flawed and damaging to us on every possible level. And so the idea that our bodies affect our minds and our emotional states and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Our bodies have have a physical imperative to die, is what you're saying. Like it's built into our systems to die. The cell on a cellular level, the cells have to die to make way for the fresh
Yes.
cells. There has
Yes.
to be a constant exchange of life and death.
Yes.
We're all just Shiva, destruction and birth, over and over and over
Yes.
again all the time. And
For the
so
preservation of the whole.
for the
Yes.
preservation of the
Of the
whole. And
whole.
that's true. And that's true on the microcosm and the macrocosm. If we all lived forever, we would eat up all the resources and be extinct in no time. We have to have the cycle of life. I mean, at every level, there has to be death for there to be life. And the carnivores, herbivores, blah, blah, blah. So, so if we have on the emotional level, the lessons from our culture that only youth is good, the obsession
Mm.
with looking young, feeling young, acting young, that the 20 somethings are where you want to be indefinitely. An active rejection and disparagement of the old, like putting them in, shunting them away and not listening to the wisdom and not, and using nursing homes in some families as a place to put the old people because you don't want to have them in your own home because you don't have time to take care of them or the ability
Mm-hmm.
to take care of them, or frankly don't want to take care of them because it's old age is scary and uncomfortable and messy. So you have that happening internally, and then this active fear and rejection of death, all fighting with the biological imperative that says we have to let death happen. So so culturally becomes emotionally, becomes behaviorally, we're fighting death every day.
In
And
a yeah.
and how that's going to be a constant, a constant agitator, a constant like battle happening inside our bodies all the time, because again, the mind affects the body.
Yep.
So that all by itself could be a reason for cancer. Like that could be another susceptibility to cancer in Americans specifically is our distaste and fear and rejection of death. That our
That is a
bodies,
really interesting hypothesis. It- that would be a very interesting hypothesis to test. Do
right?
people who so do is there some connection between people who don't want to die and people who, well, let me rephrase that. Is there some connection between people who want to live forever? Those human beings have existed for all of time and they all die eventually so far, and with cancer. Because is the mind of I never want to leave this earth on some level causing the internal cellular system to stop turning itself off when it needs to, and thus cancer? I don't know. That's a
I,
very interesting hypothesis. I have no
I
idea.
I don't either, and I think I suspect it might be. I think there's a lot of risk factors when it comes to cancer. Working with cancer, so I'm as a LMT who specialized in oncology, cancer massage. I've met a lot of people who I met a lot of people who have cancer or who have had cancer, and I think there's a series of risk factors. I think that it would make total sense to me that that would be one of them is the adherence to youth, and there's other risk factors too. There's definitely adverse childhood experiences, definitely seems to be a risk factor, and then environmental toxins, of course,
Yep.
with the. I mean, anything that disrupts the body functions it seems to be a, a potential risk of cancer, and refusing to accept death would be another disruption of the body functions.
Sure, because there is evidence. I forget what is it called? I think it's like broken heart syndrome or something, where a
Yes.
person will actually have heart failure because of the
Yes.
loss of someone they care about. So that's the mind body going from the mind to the body, where the mind is in such a state of of grief at the loss of someone that they loved so profoundly, that they literally on some level they actually damage their own heart to the point where it kills them. Like a relatively famous example of that from recent time was oh god, I'm so bad with the names of actors and actresses, but
You're gonna say Carrie Fisher, aren't you?
yes,
Yes, and Debbie
when
Reynolds.
when Carrie Fisher died, her
Yes,
mother died what, like 2 weeks after? It was
very
very fast.
very fast.
It was very
Yes.
fast. And so, that is part of it as well. You also see it a lot of the times of how elderly people, you know, elderly people will who are dying or very ill will sometimes sometimes eke their like stay alive through the end of the year holidays to have that one last one, and then they'll die. Like
Yes.
it's like they're clawing at, like, I just this one last Christmas, this one last New Year's, whatever it is, and then they pass. And
Mm-hmm.
some are successful in doing so and some are not, but it's that same kind of interesting thing. And so
The relationship between
the mind and the
mind,
body.
the mind's, yeah, the mind's desires or perceptions or belief systems, and how it affects the body. Absolutely. Um, yeah, so many different threads to pick up from all of that. I was thinking of the one thing I like to go back to is the
Mm-hmm.
idea of the cycle in relation to the mind's beliefs affecting the body. You know, I think another American problem is problem in the United States is that rejection of the idea that we are in fact dependent at any point, like being dependent. You know, the rugged individualism, American exceptionalism, bootstrap, pull up yourself up by your bootstraps, strong independent person who forges into the wilderness and makes something, and then the lone, the lone person who builds a company single handedly, even though it's all not true, right? Like we all look at Steve Jobs and say, look, he made Apple. Like, no, he didn't. He had an idea, and then he had a team of people helping him. Bill Gates, same thing. Like the Facebook guy who I can't remember his name right off the top. Anyway, the Facebook guy. Like,
Yep.
there's always people.
Zuckerberg. Yeah.
Zuckerberg. There's always, we have this the celebrity face of the person who
Mm-hmm.
created this incredible thing single handedly, and they're so powerful and strong and superheroes, and it's all a lie. No one ever does anything by themselves, right? And so, but we have this idea we have to do it ourselves, and we have to be independent, and that's our sense of self comes from our ability to care for ourselves. But in fact, the biological imperative says we do run full circle. We do start as children who are dependent, and then we have children ourselves, and then what we could be perceived as a gift our children give us is they are there for us to support us as we need support. That
Mm-hmm.
it's not something to be ashamed of or reject or pretend isn't happening, but that I get to be with my family, and I get to sit on my porch and sip tea while the house is taken care of, and I get to sit with the children. Like I contribute the way I can contribute. It's a
Sure.
piece. There's a piece of elderhood that I feel we've lost, where we get to just be with the we get to appreciate our own wisdom, and
Mm-hmm.
and because how our bodies look and the strength of our bodies goes away, so instead we offer our wisdom, and that's our contribution to the tribe, to the family, to the culture. And so, and that's appreciated by the younger generations. Like the grand will hang out with the grandchildren while you go off and hunt for wild bears or whatever. um, and I have my wisdom to share because I am now an old woman who has a lifetime of experience, and I can pass that on to my daughters and sons and grandchildren, and to appreciate that contribution of an old person. Like, that's actually that. No, they aren't able to be productive and make and produce goods and services in the market economy. They have to actually hang out at home and take care of the next generation so that they can be functional adults. Like, that's actually the role of the elders, and we've totally lost sight of that entire piece of elderhood.
Yes. It's and it's the sad part, at least right now here in the United States, is that it's being rejected by both sides of that coin. The younger generations aren't as open to hearing the wisdom of the older generations to prevent them from making similar mistakes again, thus dooming the younger generations to repeating the unlearned history. And the older generations aren't willing to also relinquish where they are. You know, it's
Yes.
they're not willing they're not willing to take that next step. They want to stay in productive, you know, champion of industry mode, when in reality they need to get to, you know, they need to get out of they need to get out of, I don't want to say get out of productivity. It's a different, it's like they need to get out of practical and into more conceptual productivity of like passing their wisdom, like doing the teaching of the next generation so that the next generation could be better than themselves and then pass the torch. But people don't want to pass the torch because they know, well, once I don't have the torch anymore, I have no, some of them might believe I have no value. Some might think, and then also is also an acceptance of I'm not the future anymore. I'm the past. And
Yes.
so
And that's another piece of accepting death as a
death.
concept in the first place.
Yeah.
And it's yes, if you can't accept your own death, then you can't, then, and your whole value is in being alive, then you can't give up the control over the things that are happening around you. You have to be a part of that, because that is life now. And
Yes.
that's your existence is based on the doing those things and not the teaching and relinquishing phase, which has to happen to 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 die comfortably, to and that you need that to be able to talk about your own death.
Yes.
And then here we bow back to the original point, is that people don't want to.
Don't want to talk about. Well, no, even myself. So I'm 35 years old. So generationally, I'm on the older end of the millennial spectrum. I'm an elder millennial, to steal that from a famous comedian. And and it is weird. Just the other day, I was listening to a podcast where the person being interviewed was someone who was a Zoomer or is a Zoomer. So someone
Mhm.
who's from the generation beneath me, as someone who was born after the 2000s,
Mhm.
who is, you know, now they're 21. The oldest of them are 21 years old. They're adults. So they were taught, so the other people in that interview were saying how, like, you're now the next generation. And in my head, I'm like, wait, what about me? Like we've been talking about millennials for a while now, and it's like I thought I was the next generation. I'm like, oh shit, there always is the one beneath me, and then the
Yep.
one beneath them. And
Yes.
so for me, even though, yeah, I'm only 35, yes, I'm still very young. Yes, I still have, in theory, I have decades of life ahead of me, assuming I don't do anything dumb or have an accident. But like at the same time, it is there was certainly that ping of like, oh God, I'm not the next generation anymore. I'm somewhere in the middle. On the earlier
Mhm.
end, sure, but in the middle. So
Mhm.
I got a taste of what the boomer generation is in the height of right now. Of they are really, like, you know, the boomer generation, you're talking 60, 70 years old here. They're at that point where like they should start taking a step back and letting Gen X come in and start doing things, or the millennials, and now the upcoming Zoomers. And they're not, a lot of them. But that was not, I don't want to paint too broadly generationally, because I hated when they do that with millennials too. But like there was so much value placed on the boomer generation towards work-based productivity, where their life is their work. So it makes
Absolutely.
sense why they're not giving up work, because it's their life.
Absolutely. My father had that problem. He retired, and immediately he was home for 6 months and went back to work. He ended up going to a company that he worked at for 2 years, and he hated it working there, but he didn't know what else to do, and so he kept doing it. It took him years to figure out to become. He was a high school math teacher, excuse me, and then became a adjunct math professor, which seemed. I have to say he had to give that up 2 3 years ago, and it he never found anything to replace his work life as a way of personal self-fulfillment. He absolutely needed it. He had an amazing he had an amazing social network. He was actually a bit of a legend in his community, and lovely man. But he always felt lesser than because he couldn't do the things he had always done, and he had such he really struggled with those losses. So it's that's the the thing with the boomers. And just a funny little aside that pinged into my brain about my generation, because I'm at 51, I am solidly Generation X, is that we have this weird state of being the forgotten generation at every turn, to the point even when the big joke, my son exposes me to all these memes, and Gen X, the memes and is all about how we were the first latchkey generation.
Mm-hmm.
We were the first generation where our parents both worked all day and we came home to an empty house. The boomers grew up with mom at home, and we decidedly did not. And the 80s was the beginning of the whole greed is good generation. Anyway, um, uh, capitalism really took its hold on the culture. So we were literally we joke about how we raised ourselves. So
Mm-hmm.
I learned how to make dinner very young, and was responsible for getting myself my own homework. And by the time I was 13, I was home. We were home alone until 5 or 6 o'clock every day, and and not given a lot of parenting. And not to put down my parents at all. They were locked. They were also the first. This is the first time in generation where both my parents had to work.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't actually didn't have the luxury with their incomes. They didn't have the luxury of mom staying at home any longer, and so they were forced into this into the market economy to behave a certain way to make ends meet. And so we, as Gen X, had to raise ourselves to a large degree, and we were left to our own devices to a huge degree. And now here we are, when we also should be, have the elders like handing over the reins. Once again, we're being ignored. So it's just, I hadn't put that together before, actually. It's just really interesting that there's this theme in our generation that just keeps going and going. And we may, in fact, like poor Prince Charles, who never gets to be king because his mother just keeps living and living. We're going to be the generation that never quite gets to take over, because by the time we can, we'll be too old. And it'll be your generation who's actually in charge at some point when the boomers are no longer able to do it.
We'll see how that goes, because
I know.
right now, I don't want to bash the boomers too much, but I will say, once again, yes, we're talking very generationally, so there's going to be a lot of, this is very vague talk, but
Absolutely, yeah. I don't cast aspersions on
yeah, no,
any member
agreed,
of a
agreed.
generation. These are cultural trends we're talking about,
Yes,
not individual behavior.
but it's something that I've certainly noticed with my generation, with the millennials, that we have learned from witnessing the boomers of, you know, the cost the cost of having work be the purpose of life. There's a reason why.
Yes.
So
Well, that's good. That's excellent that the older generations can provide lessons for you, even if they're not intending to pass on those lessons.
yes, yes. So it's a blessing and a curse, because the irony being that sometimes the older generations will judge the younger generations for being lazy, which I think every generation has done that throughout all of time.
It seems like a common theme. Yeah.
Yes, it seems to be a very common theme. And the irony of what we said before, of valuing a youthful body but not a youthful mind.
Right? Yes.
It's just kind of funny.
Yes. No,
And
it's interesting, isn't it?
no, it's that classic saying of youth is wasted on the young. And it's like, if the older if the older generation, whoever they are, could have the vitality of youth but the wisdom of their own age, that would be a unique form of humanity. But that just isn't possible right now. And so, it would also dramatically alter humanity if that went there, but that's a different kind of conversation. But so the millennial generation certainly has pushed a lot of the has certainly pushed a lot of the work-life balance kind of talk. That's a big thing of the millennial generation,
which is great. It
um,
needs to, that
which
conversation is
needs to
long overdue.
happen. Yes, but then there are parts of the millennial generation, I'll throw my own generation under the bus, where a consequence of the digital age, of the expectation of them to get handed everything that they want immediately. And so that is something that was, I see you holding back a laugh, that is something where the older generations are used to having to put in years of backbreaking work to slowly build their empires. And now they have an empire that they control. And the younger generations are kind of like, well, why can't I just have it now? And some of that is certainly, compared to the past, technology and that specific sliver of the industry, a young person can become massively wealthy very quickly. Go back to Zuckerberg, go back to, the inventors of apps and things like that, where they could be 22 and then be a millionaire or even a billionaire. Go into YouTube stars, go into TikTok stars and things like that. It's, you're talking about like Bieber, as a perfect example, was discovered as a 16-year-old posting videos on YouTube, and now he's internationally well known. So like that is now possible today because of technology that was not possible in the past.
And it's the same as it's the same lore as playing the lottery.
Mm-hmm.
It,
And
it's the same
so,
mentality as
yes.
lotteries, however.
And the unfortunate thing that I certainly have noticed. So, like I said, I am an older millennial. I was born in 1985. So I remember a time before computers. I remember learning how to type on, I'm trying to remember now. I want to get this accurate. I remember when doctors' offices and things still had typewriters. My family had a typewriter that I used to play with. Like, I remember, like, my family's first computer was a Windows 3.1. This was for the younger generation. This was a computer that had no modem. This was a computer that you had to boot into DOS. There was no. This is before CD drive. This was still like the old school floppy disk drive, and then the smaller floppy disk drive, which the younger generations nowadays are like, what the hell's a floppy disk? Period. It's the save icon on Microsoft Word. That's what that was. It was an actual thing. And so
Ancient history.
I know, right? It is ancient history. And so I remember that transition. I remember my mom, showing me us having cable for the first time, and we no longer had air, which doesn't even exist today because everything went digital. And
Mm-hmm.
so, you know, something I've noticed though is that because the older generations have some of them, it's getting better now, but some of them have a level of ignorance of technology and a resistance in the earlier days towards technology. That wisdom coming from the older generation didn't translate through 100% to the younger generation because of that technological disconnect.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't thought of that, creating another barrier between
Yes,
another.
you have a tech barrier in a
Yeah, that's
weird way.
interesting. No, no,
So
that's a good point.
certain things, the tried and true methods, which are still true, of working hard and determination and and learning how to fail and then recover from failure, learning from that and doing it again. Those lessons aren't being carried over because all people see in the social media world are success. They
Mm-hmm.
don't see the failures because it's all been
Mm-hmm.
sanitized.
Yes.
The pictures you see on Instagram, you don't see the 50 other ones that were deleted. And that's the thing. You don't see that anymore.
Yes.
And the
But
aversion of the boomers with the level of work they put into their lives and the fact that their children, all they witnessed was the absence of a parent. There also is a level of resentment, whether it's
mm-hmm.
conscious or not. It's
Oh,
like you
absolutely.
sold your soul to your job, and you ignored me, your kid. Like you said, your whole generation was ignored as latchkey kid generation. And so, my generation I'm more unique. Being the children of immigrants, I was able to still, I got lucky where I had a stay-at-home mom. So I didn't have full latchkey like you did. So I had a taste of being raised in a way that is slowly falling out of fashion, because not out of fashion, out of practicality. It's very rare
Absolutely.
nowadays for there to be one parent to stay at home. It's a very difficult thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so compared to the past where it was the norm, where one income was more than enough. So
Mm-hmm.
there's all these different disconnects, and that passage of knowledge isn't happening like it was happening in the past, which is super unfortunate. And so I don't know. It'll be really interesting to see what happens. Oh, what?
I have so many things to say.
Oh, go, because go.
I've
I
got
kind of hit the end of my strain there.
so many things going click, click, click of, oh yeah, and oh yeah, I'm trying to make notes while you're talking.
No,
Uh,
go, run, go, run with
yeah,
it.
so many pieces. So I'm thinking about all the things that cause the disconnect, like why,
Hmm.
and because that's what it comes down to. It's, you know, there are no metaphors. Everything is just a repeating pattern. And, so if our podcast is focusing on, has as a fundamental piece is the reintegration of mind body connection.
Hmm.
Reintegration is necessary in every aspect of our lives right now,
Oh yeah.
including the reintegration of the old and the old and the young. That's what we're talking about. It's a everyone's behaving as if the mind is separate from the body, that the experience of youth is separate from the experience of the elders, that there's a hierarchy as well. It's not just separation, but there's a hierarchy. The mind has been primary over the body for a couple hundred years. Aristotle and those folks, like the logical mind is the most important thing, and the body is this kind of distasteful annoyance we have to cart around with us. And the older generation sees often there are elders who see the young as you say, youth is wasted on them, that
Hmm.
their contributions aren't, like, not valuing their contributions for what they have to offer from where they are. And the same with the young, not valuing the elders of their contributions for where they are. And there's the issue also of, because there's so much value on being young, it's interfering with, I think, the elders' own ability to become actual elders and embrace their wisdom, embrace the part of themselves that they have like, not allowing themselves to access their own wisdom and live in their wisdom, because they're so busy sending energy to being young and in control and doing young things. And so you only have so much energy, right?
Hmm.
We only have so much energy to expend on our thoughts and our feelings and our day. And so if we're in a state where we're older, but we're only thinking about what we can do like a young person would do, or like we did when we were 35 years old, we're not spending time on becoming more wise. We're not doing our inner work. We're not making our own internal connections between what we've learned and what happened to us and what we've learned from it. We're not necessarily doing the processing time with what we're experiencing. So we're so busy living in the getting things done and keeping up with everyone else, and that's in the hierarchical system. That's where value lies. We are only valuable if we're having our jobs, which means we're not spending time on becoming wise.
Yes, and
and
that,
and
yeah.
and that's what we're best at once we're over a certain age. That's actually what our contribution. So we're not so a certain amount of resentment among the generations is we're not creating the we're not doing our proper roles for each other. And that's the thing too, like knowing, claiming responsibility is the other piece I was thinking about.
Hmm.
Like being like, my responsibility is to perform this role for the greater good, the good of my
Hmm.
tribe. And therefore I have to let go of those things over there. I have to let go of my independence. I have to let go of my job. I have to let go of making all the decisions myself. And I have to provide this role instead. I have to allow myself to be cared for by my children. Like, it all comes back to the end of, it's all the same conversation. And the
No.
youth, and so for the youth too, here's my role is, I don't know everything. I don't. I can't know I don't know everything, and that's okay. I'm young and I'm strong and I'm healthy and I can listen and I can learn from the wisdom of my elders, as long as they respect what I have to offer in return. That's all anyone wants, is mutual respect. So if we're not respecting the old because they're old, and we're not respecting the young because they don't know enough, like it's just a constant, you know, it's a dead end for everybody. And then there has to be vulnerability, right? Like, I here's what I can do, and I can't do that because it's not, I can't do it that well because of where I, and that's okay. I get to do this. I can do this well instead. And yes, I can relinquish control to each party for what they are best at doing. So not seeing a hierarchy anymore, but just equal parts. Mind and body are equal parts. They're both absolutely necessary for the health of the species. And the olders and the youngers have to be in connection for the health of the tribe. So so
But you have it dead on right. It's we are born with consciousness that we or feel or believe to be immortal. But the bodies that come with that consciousness is finite. And we have this perpetual disconnect between the two. We think our consciousness will go on forever. And a lot of us live that way. But we need to realize that our bodies won't, and that we need to live according to the fact that time is limited and we don't know when our number is up. So part of that is, like you said, of doing things to benefit the tribe. And but a part of that is also doing things to benefit oneself too.
of course.
Because
And that's, again, there shouldn't be any dichotomy there. It shouldn't be me
yes,
or the tribe. It should be
it
me
should be
and the
both.
tribe.
Because if a person chooses to only work and always kicks the can of doing things to fulfill themselves down the road, assuming the road keeps going forever, that can will get kicked off the cliff, and then they'll be like, wait, what? And then time is up. And then
Mm-hmm.
you end up having those end of life regrets of, you hear that cliche all the time of, no one on their deathbed is saying, I wish I responded to one more email. That's not a thing. People end up saying more profound, I wish I spent more time with my family. I wish I traveled more. I wish I was more brave. I
Of
wish I did
course.
different things. And so it's that. Go ahead.
and and here's another reason for that disconnect is, there's nothing as grounding in that reality as being at the bedside of a loved one who's dying and being part of that process and being
Yep.
part of the aging process. So the younger generation, it's another piece of wisdom the elders have an opportunity to give to the youngers, is allowing themselves to be witnessed as they become sick and die. And on both sides, right? That the youngers aren't afraid of, or disgusted by it. But that's a cultural problem. I don't, we don't aren't naturally disgusted or afraid of illness and death. That's something we're taught. And that the elders are willing to be vulnerable, that they are willing to give up their independence. They're willing to say, yes, I'll wear a lifeline and I'll call you every day. Yes, let's talk about living situations where you can see me and I can be cared for, if not by you, by someone let's talk about what our choices are. And then being with that older person at the end, I can't, this is a conversation for a different podcast, because I would go on and on about this. It's just, there's a physical reality to being with someone who's dying that settles, the body responds to losing someone. And so
Mm.
on the cellular level, you become more, by being with someone who's sick and dying, the animal part of us, the body part of us, gains wisdom in what it actually means to be sick and dying. And that we carry that with us for when we are in that situation ourselves, so that we then can enter gracefully and with the appropriate, appropriate meaning, right for us as a human, the biological human, enter that phase of our lives with eyes open and willing to talk about how we're going to manage our infirmity and our death. in an open and honest way with the younger generation who, you know, they take their leads from us. You know, they may say they reject us, but they're still watching. Just like you said, you know,
Mm-hmm.
your generation's watching the baby boomers and making decisions about your own, you know, work life balance. So we pass on our perceptions of death and dying to our younger generations from the very beginning. And the more we talk about it as an open openly as something that's simply going to happen without judgment, you know, just it just is what happens. We can allow the wisdom, and that's where wisdom comes, right, from vulnerability, from being vulnerable and admitting we don't know everything and being willing to hear from someone else the things we need to know. And that's where, and that's what's where I think our culturally we a place for us to go. And I respect Brene Brown so much for her work on vulnerability, because, you know, letting go of hierarchy and the need for control and being vulnerable with each other is the best first step towards healing the rifts between the generations and the rifts between every group I can think of where there's some struggle for control and you know, a need to be above someone else or controlling something else outside ourselves. So
Yeah, and something that has contributed to that, in particular in the United States, is the continuation of the sanitizing of the end of life care, of
mm-hmm.
it's
Oh,
the ushering off to the nursing home. it's
I'm
it's someone else deals with it. Even when the person actually passes, it's someone else deals with it. And so,
I'm tapping right now because
okay.
I'm having a response to that. You said the word sanitize, and all I could think of was the ICU where my father was for 5 days before he passed, and it's just a quick story about that. I don't know if anyone has been inside an ICU, not recently, probably, because I know most hospitals you can't visit someone in the hospital because of COVID unless they're actively dying. It was the state of the hospitals in New York State where my father lived, and the ICU, it's it's not a it's a place to keep people alive, not a place to let them die. It's
Mm,
the environment is entirely geared toward, you know, the lights are bright all the time, the rooms are cavernous so you can bring in lots of equipment to be around the person in the bed. You know, the bed is raised and like you're like it's like a spotlight is on you where all this focus is on these other people are coming in to do things to you. It's a position of like you're helpless and scrutinized, and I understand why it's set up that way because you know the Western thought is, has been for a really long time, and I think is only now starting to, you know, to be softened a little bit, is that you want to keep people alive at all costs, and so you create an environment where you have the opportunity to make sure they stay alive at all costs, and that so it's sanitizing, like literally sanitized, where everything's white and clean and bright and shiny and hard with equipment
mm,
and metal and you know and flooring and that and bright lights, um, and saying, you know, we're going to do everything possible to make sure you stay alive. Like that's the whole point, even when that's not actually the best outcome for anybody, is to go down that route, and there's no room for the other route. Like there's no room
yeah.
for the acknowledgement that this might be this person's last moment on earth, and they're in an environment that's like antithetical to allowing the death happen in a way that's nourishing for the dying and for the family. And frankly, I mean, we were, God, quote unquote, lucky that they needed the ICU bed because of COVID. So they moved my dad into a room, which I could go on a while for about, hospital rooms are certainly, you know, not exactly terribly conducive to someone dying in them either. But at least the lights were dimmer. It was smaller. You know, there's two very amazing nurses came in, and just a shout out to St. Peter's Hospital, and the nursing staff there were amazingly. wonderful for us. You get to, and at that point we were allowed to be with my dad because we knew he was dying, and at least it was quiet and
Mm.
dim, and I could hold his hand, and he was left alone. Like they came in every so often to give him pain medication. That was it, and he was just left to do his work in a quiet environment, and 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 the room. My sister was pretty upset about the room because it was ugly and small and utilitarian, and everything was hard and uncomfortable except for my dad's bed, but it was still better than the ICU.
Sure.
So thinking of hospitals in terms, it's a similar transition that can happen with dying, that already has happened for a lot of hospitals with giving birth. Again, to go back to the same analogy, where you know the hospital room at Bay State that I was in for my first son it was a sanitized, hard, nasty medical room, which again, for the warm, fuzzy things of giving birth, it was not a very nice environment at all. But now, the birthing center movement took over, so you have a room that looks more like a hotel room or like a bedroom, where there's places, the comfy chairs to sit in, and there's room for family to be in there with you, and just the consciousness that there needs to be a nourishing, quiet environment for a respectful, quiet, nourishing environment for the mother to let her do her work. This isn't a medical emergency that she's giving birth. Just like dying is doesn't have to be a medical emergency either. If you're allowing someone to die, the medical emergency goes away. When
Yep.
you when you're keeping them alive at all costs, it's all an emergency. Quick restart their heart, quick get their breathing going, quick inject them with more medications. But if you're and it's about respecting the body. The mother's body knows how to give birth. 95% of all births are completely fine. There's no issues, maybe even higher than 95% nowadays. Um, people are available to step in if necessary, but we assume the health of the mother. And we can do the same thing for the death of the older person, that they know how to do this. We know how to die, just like you said. And so providing a death environment that's similar to a birthing environment makes so much sense, to normalize death and to provide a nourishing opportunity for the family and the dying one, to let them go respectfully.
Yeah, yes, because a situation, something like you were saying, the ICU, is more appropriate for a person who has been severely injured to get recovery. Like, it was this person, we don't want this person to die. This person should not die right now. Same thing with illness. Like, this person, has,
With a strong expectation of recovery, it makes perfect sense.
yeah, yeah. But you're totally right. That would be a very fascinating movement to happen, but that would require an immense amount of self-reflection on Americans, or I guess humanity in general. But like, it would be very interesting if there was such a thing as, the a, a death suite, as weird as that might sound, of just,
Well, actually, there was a hospice wing of this hospital, which I did not get to go
oh,
visit.
okay. I didn't know that even was a
I'm
thing.
sorry, I'm remembering now that in
Sure.
fact, at least at St. Peter's in Albany, they did have a section of the hospital that, and I wish I had gotten a chance to see it, because that's initially we thought he might be going there, and it turns out it was too late there was no need to move him. He was going to be gone too quickly to move him
Mm,
into hospice. But I'm wondering if the rooms, in fact, are more like a birthing center. Maybe I can find pictures online, and if there's a common thing for hospitals to have a hospice center, where in fact it's not, doesn't look like an ICU. It's more like a more comfortable and
yep.
welcoming and quiet, and just a better place to die and to be with someone who's dying.
Yeah, or even better, similar, once again comparing it to birth, with the popularity of at-home births, for people, just like there is at-home hospice care where,
There
the
is.
person can pass on in the comfort of their home, hopefully surrounded by their loved ones, and then you just have the nurse who's there just to make it easier, to lessen the discomfort and the pain that comes from the act of dying.
Hospice care is great. I've had a lot of interactions with hospice care because I've done a lot of in-home massage with folks who were dying from cancer, and It's a tremendously positive movement in the realm of death and dying. It's we could spend even more money sending more people to the homes. In my experience with people dying at home, is that either a child or children or the spouse still has to spend, like, in order for that person to die at home, they are giving their lives over day in day out because there isn't enough staff to actually take care of the dying person, that they don't, that someone has there, this our healthcare system does not currently allow for the person to die at home and not kind of wreck the family in the process.
No, 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 that makes sense. A, a hospice wing, when it comes to staff, makes more sense because the same nurse can go from room to room to room checking on people. Having a nurse go from person's home to person's home to person's home, and then like if something happens, they have to drive back. Like, yes, from a staffing perspective, yes, it would be immensely more difficult and require more physical people to do it compared to being
Yeah,
someplace localized. So
but still, to me, it's still a huge step in the right direction. Just the fact that we have hospice at all, that we're finally saying no, it's okay for to let people go, and
yes.
and again, with the respecting the end of life care being not something to fight it every tooth and nail, but to allow to happen. At least in the Northeast, I don't know nationally how popular hospice is, or
I have no idea.
given budget constraints and regions where there, yeah, I don't really know much about it nationally. I just know in the Northeast, I think hospice is serving us quite very well, but there's still a lot of space to improve. There's plenty more that needs to be done for that whole process.
And that's the thing too that compounds this issue even more, is that when it comes to putting those legal barriers towards the continuation of perpetual end of life care, the DNRs and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
that needs to be done while the individual is still competent. And
Absolutely.
since so many of us don't want to have those conversations, by the time it gets to the point where they're in the throes of dying, if they don't like, they know they themselves can no longer, if they're unconscious or whatever, they themselves can no longer say stop, just let me go. And then you get those terrible incidents of the person just keeps being revived over and over again until the point where they can't be revived, and it makes the process of dying
Oh, it's
horrible. I can, like,
horrible.
horrible.
Absolutely, no one deserves that, and it's a cruel thing to do to your children or spouse also. When if you don't name a health, just so quick little public service announcement as to it doesn't cost anything. You can download the forms to name your healthcare proxy
Yep.
of the person, and then you can download the forms also of what you do and do not want to have happen. When to resuscitate, when not to resuscitate. I'm very grateful my father did that. He didn't talk to me about any of this, but at least he did download the forms and
he
signed
gave you
them.
the
And
he gave you the authority to deal with it.
he gave us the authority to deal with it because especially because we couldn't visit him and see what was happening. We really had to rely on the doctors as well. So then if the doctors were the ones making all the decisions, I can't even imagine what that would
Well,
have been
the
like, and
doctors are,
dealing with
their job is to keep people alive.
it. They are, and the doctors, I have to say, the doctors were fabulous, and they one thing, it's again another thread that something you said earlier about how 2 weeks away
Yep.
from someone
I,
dying, there's
I need to
markers
I need to find
of,
that again. Yes.
or some period you can actually mark when someone's dying. Well, anyone who's worked with death and dying people develops a sense of it. Like they know when someone is near death just by looking at them, listening to them breathe, and I'm not sure if they even or have full consciousness over what they're noticing about the dying person, but I've seen it over and over again. People who work in hospice care know when someone is getting near the end. In fact,
Mm.
my own nurses for my father, I was with him. It was evening, and we were making a decision. My sister was exhausted. I wanted to go home, and we're making a decision what to do next. And I said, I think I need to, my sister needs rest. I need to go home, and she needs to go home, and we'll be back in the morning. And the nurse looks at me and says, "I just want you to be aware that it's possible he won't survive the night. And I said to her, I know you can't, of course, predict anything, but what if you had to guess? What's your sense of what's going to happen? She looks at him and says, I think he's getting near the end. And 10 hours later, he was gone.
Mm.
And I've had other people tell me the same stories. Someone in hospice, someone, the dying person sitting up in bed and chatting with his his spouse, and the hospice person pulls someone aside and says, "Make sure everyone who wants to see him sees him today." Like, why? He's going to go soon, but there was no. They couldn't see any kind of indicator. So
It's
it's
intuition.
it's clear it's intuition. And so in fact, long story short, too late, when I working with my father, when the doctors were working with my father, they very clearly can't give any recommendations.
Mm.
They can't say, I don't think he's going to wake up. They can say, because he had multiple strokes, as it turns out, he'd had multiple strokes. We didn't actually know that for a few days.
Mm-hmm.
All they can say is they have to say both sides at all times. It's possible he can wake up and be himself again. We will, it's a waiting game.
Mm.
And he never actively said, and he could never say, in my personal opinion, from seeing patients like this, he's probably not going to wake up, or if he does, he's going to be severely damaged. He never could say those things. He couldn't be honest about it. He had to
Yep.
just give very flat, but it was clear that tiny little hints in the way they said things that they thought he was probably done. But they clearly. So I'm wondering how much of that is that a lawsuit thing? Is that a cultural thing where or is it a feeling like you always have to? It's like they always had to provide us with the idea of hope. And we did run
Yep.
across that a couple doctors. He was in 2 different hospitals because of the first hospital, the ICUs were full and they had to move him.
Mm-hmm.
So the ER nurse in the first hospital, no, ER doctor in the first hospital was like, oh yeah, we got his oxygen levels up. He's much better now. He wasn't better,
Mm-hmm.
but that's the initial there. Many of the doctors clearly felt they had to put a positive spin, even though it wasn't his condition was not positive at all. So I feel for doctors. I don't even know where they legally have to sit on this. Do they always have to provide? Yes, it's possible. Basically, all of them always said, yes, it's possible for him to survive this, until the MRI came where it's clear he'd had multiple strokes. And even then, they said, so he's had multiple strokes. It's probably isn't going to be himself if he wakes up. But even then, like it's
Yeah.
they're just so careful to make sure. And I assume a lot of it is cultural, because a lot of people, if you come into the situation not having thought about death, not willing to accept death as an option, believing there's always hope, wanting someone to wake up, and then would we have, if we were one of those people, would we have left him on the ventilator for the next couple of weeks hoping he was going to wake up? Maybe. It's so there's all these pieces that I'm sure the doctors have to weigh and balance and struggle with in order to manage care in a way that's providing information as best they can without really giving an opinion, just so they're not putting it in a position where it's untenable for them. So
Yeah.
I don't
And
know if I just made any sense at all, but
no, it
I can
did.
see where it's just a complicated
Yeah.
system in the hospital. And there's the thing: it's kind of like how some things shouldn't be legislated in Congress.
Mm.
Some things should not be decided by doctors. Like it's not their, like they give info, like they're like the elders. They should give information. Here's what we know. Here's all the data. Here's some trends I've seen with other
Yep.
patients. But this decision has to be the families.
And that's the thing. My gut is probably saying it is liability, but yeah, like if I had to take a guess, it's probably liability, where they probably weren't lying to you, that there is a chance. Is that a get struck by lightning chance? Is that a win the Powerball when it's $20 million chance? Like, that's not zero. And that's the thing, that is something in the medical world that sometimes we don't we as non-medical people don't acknowledge or are aware of 100% is that it is never black and white when it comes to medical decisions. You know,
and and
you could get your appendix removed and possibly die on the table, even though the chances of
yes.
dying are like a couple of percentage points. Or you could do some crazy risky procedure where the chance of survival is 5% and then live. And so
And that's
it's
and
so strange.
absolutely it is, and that's why, in fact, again, everyone listening, for goodness sakes, if you don't have one already, do a healthcare proxy, because
Hmm.
because not only so that we had control over what happened to Dad, but that we knew what he wanted
Hmm.
was enormously um, comforting to us. That we knew we were really following his wishes, and not keeping him alive past when something. Yeah, it knowing what to do. That was not our choosing, but him telling us what he wanted. Um, it just made the whole process much less wrenching. It's that's the thing. Like, you're in the space of watching your loved one die, hooked up to machines, and then deciding whether we should we should let him go or not knowing what he wants. Oh my
Mm,
goodness! Like, what a
yeah,
again, for the sake of your loved ones, you fill out the healthcare proxy. If not for yourself, do it for them, because I'm just so grateful I wasn't put in a position where there was any question over what he wanted and what to do once we knew the full extent of what had happened to him. Um, yeah, losing someone is terrible, and there's no reason to make it more terrible if you can possibly avoid it.
for sure.
Mm.
I think that might be a good spot to stop.
I think that's a good spot to stop today.
So, thank you all for listening to this particularly interesting and slightly morbid episode of the Take a Breather podcast.
Well, that's that. Well, we're going to say, let's use a different term for it. Useful, informative, and educational
Yes.
episode of the podcast,
Yes.
because
Very
that's
true.
let's get these conversations out in the world and be acceptable conversations to have with each other
Yes.
and with our loved ones, that we can
Yes.
be honest about what we need and want, and to just respect each other's needs in all cycles of our lives.
Absolutely. And this is, I think, one single bullet point of the 50 bullet points we have when it came to this particular topic. So I am sure we will have another episode similar to this one. I believe it wouldn't be surprised if death turns into a series that we talk about, but we will do our best to spread it around so that we're not as hitting everyone over the head with it all the time. But thank
Yes.
you again for listening. Thank you, Stacy, for being very open about what was going on with your father in
Yeah.
particular. I'm sure that wasn't the easiest thing to do at times.
No, it's cathartic to talk about this. It's there's things that we're afraid of, and they become even more fearful when we suppress them. And
Mm,
s and the monster in the closet. You open the closet door and let in the light, and there's no monster there. And that's true of these conversations about death too. The anticipation is worse than the reality when it comes to talking about death.
yes. Yes. So
Mm.
let's end on those wise words, and we'll talk to everyone again next time.
Excellent. Bye.